At 23:40 on December 29, 1944, Major Carroll C. Smith crouched in the cramped cockpit of his P-61 Black Widow at McGuire Field, Mindoro, watching his radar operator track a contact moving at 180 knots through the black skies north of the Philippine Islands. 26 years old, 43 combat missions, 4 confirmed kills. The Japanese had sent 12 bombers to destroy the American airfields that night. Smith knew the pattern. For 2 weeks, Japanese bombers had attacked Mindoro every single night. 334 air raid alerts in 14 days. American engineers were building 2 airfields to support the Lingayen Gulf invasion. The Japanese understood what those airfields meant. If American fighters could operate from Mindoro, they could cover the entire invasion force. The Japanese had to stop construction. They sent bombers every night. Conventional bombers, kamikazes, anything that could carry explosives. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron had arrived at Mindoro on December 26th, 3 days earlier. Smith's squadron was the only thing standing between those bombers and 20,000 American troops sleeping in tents below. The pressure was suffocating. Every bomber that got through meant dead engineers, dead construction crews, delayed airfields, a delayed invasion, more American casualties at Lingayen Gulf. Smith's P-61 was different from anything the Japanese had encountered. The Northrop Black Widow was the first American aircraft designed specifically for night combat. 66-foot wingspan, twin Pratt & Whitney R2800 engines producing 2,000 horsepower each. Top speed, 366 miles per hour. But the real weapon wasn't the 4 20mm cannons mounted in the belly. It was the SCR-720 radar mounted in the nose. The radar could detect aircraft up to 5 miles away in complete darkness. The Japanese had no idea it existed. Their bombers flew at night because they believed darkness made them invisible. They were wrong. The radar operator sat behind Smith in a separate compartment, watching a glowing screen that showed every aircraft within range. Lieutenant Philip Porter was Smith's radar operator. He'd been tracking targets for 6 months. He knew how to read the scope, how to vector Smith toward contacts, how to separate friendly aircraft from enemy bombers. The problem was simple. 1 P-61, 12 Japanese bombers. If Smith engaged one target, 11 others would slip through to bomb the airfields. The mathematics were brutal. Even if Smith shot down 3 or 4 bombers, the rest would complete their mission. American casualties would mount. The airfields would be damaged. The invasion schedule would slip. Smith had trained for this moment for 18 months. Night fighter training at Orlando Army Airfield in Florida, radar intercept procedures, night navigation, gunnery practice in total darkness. The training was exhaustive because night fighting was the most dangerous form of aerial combat. No visual references, no horizon, just instruments and radar returns, and the hope that the target you were tracking wasn't friendly. The 418th had flown its first combat mission in November 1943, operating from primitive airstrips in New Guinea, flying P-70 Havocs at first, then modified P-38 Lightnings with experimental radar. The P-61s arrived in September 1944. The Black Widow was everything the earlier night fighters weren't. Stable, forgiving, powerful. The radar actually worked. But radar couldn't solve Smith's problem tonight. 12 bombers were coming. His fuel would last maybe 3 hours. If he spent 10 minutes engaging each target, he could only intercept 3 bombers before he had to return to base. 9 bombers would get through. 9 bombers meant hundreds of casualties. Maybe thousands if they hit the fuel dumps or ammunition storage. If you want to see how Smith hunted down 4 Japanese bombers in total darkness, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Smith. Porter's voice crackled through the intercom at 23:42. He had 4 separate contacts on the scope, all heading south toward Mindoro, all at different altitudes. Smith had to make a choice, which bomber to pursue first, and whether his plan to intercept all 4 in one night was genius or suicide. Smith pushed the throttles forward. The twin R2800 engines responded instantly. The Black Widow climbed at 2,000 feet per minute. Porter called out vectors. Heading 035, altitude 8,000 feet, range 4 miles. Smith couldn't see anything through the canopy, just blackness. No moon, no stars. Heavy clouds obscured everything. This was why the Japanese chose tonight. Complete darkness meant their bombers were invisible to conventional fighters. But Smith wasn't flying a conventional fighter. The SCR-720 radar used a rotating parabolic dish mounted in the nose. The dish sent out microwave pulses at 180 degrees forward. When those pulses hit an aircraft, they bounced back. The radar operator's scope showed the return as a glowing blip. The scope had two displays. One showed azimuth, left or right of the aircraft's nose. The other showed elevation, above or below the aircraft. Porter watched both scopes simultaneously. He guided Smith toward the target using verbal corrections. Left 5 degrees, down 3 degrees. The system worked because Porter was exceptional at his job. Range 3 miles. Smith activated his own radar scope. A smaller display integrated into the main instrument panel. When the target got close enough, Smith could track it himself. The pilot's scope was simpler than Porter's. Just one display showing range and relative position. But it was enough. Once Smith had the target on his scope, he could close for the kill without relying on verbal instructions. The Japanese bomber was a Mitsubishi G4M. The Americans called it Betty. 2,000 horsepower Mitsubishi Kase engines. Maximum speed 270 miles per hour. Crew of 7. Bomb load 1,760 pounds. The Betty had a critical weakness. No self-sealing fuel tanks. One burst from Smith's cannons would turn the bomber into a fireball. Range 2 miles. Smith could see the target on his scope now. The blip was steady. The bomber crew had no idea Smith was behind them. Japanese bombers had no tail warning radar. No way to detect a pursuing night fighter. They flew in darkness, believing they were safe. The P-61 made that assumption fatal. Smith closed to 1,000 yards. Still couldn't see the Betty visually. The darkness was absolute. He relied entirely on the radar scope. The blip grew larger as the range decreased. 800 yards, 700, 600. At 500 yards, Smith finally saw it. A dark shape against slightly less dark clouds. The bomber's exhaust flames were barely visible. Faint orange glows from the engine nacelles. Smith moved the P-61 into position. Slightly below the bomber, slightly behind. The four 20mm Hispano M2 cannons were mounted in the lower fuselage. Fixed forward. Smith had to aim the entire aircraft. He used the N6 gun sight integrated into his instrument panel. The gun sight projected an illuminated reticle onto a combining glass. Smith adjusted his position until the bomber sat centered in the reticle. Range 400 yards. Smith armed the cannons. Each cannon carried 200 rounds. 800 rounds total. Enough for approximately 40 seconds of sustained fire. But Smith wouldn't need 40 seconds. Night fighter doctrine called for short, concentrated bursts. Get close. Fire. Confirm the kill. Move to the next target. Wasting ammunition on a single bomber meant fewer rounds for the remaining targets. Smith squeezed the trigger at 350 yards. The four cannons fired in unison. The sound was deafening even through the engine noise. 20mm high-explosive shells streamed toward the Betty at 2,800 feet per second. The tracers looked like red lines drawn across the darkness. Smith fired for 2 seconds. 12 rounds per cannon, 48 shells total. The Betty's right wing exploded. Fuel ignited instantly. The bomber rolled right and entered a steep dive. Smith watched it fall. The burning aircraft illuminated the clouds below. It hit the water 8 miles north of Mindoro at 23:57. One bomber down, 11 remaining. But Smith's fuel gauge showed he'd burned through 15% of his fuel, and 3 more contacts were still on Porter's scope, all heading toward the airfields, all separated by miles of black sky. And Smith had exactly 112 minutes of fuel remaining. Porter identified the second target at 0014 on December 30th. Heading 180. Altitude 6,000 feet. Range 6 miles. Smith turned the P-61 south and descended. The problem was geometry. The second bomber was 23 miles from the first kill. Smith's P-61 cruised at 280 miles per hour. That meant roughly 5 minutes to intercept. 5 minutes the bomber spent flying closer to Mindoro, closer to the airfields, closer to completing its mission. Smith pushed the Black Widow faster. 320 miles per hour. The R-2800 engines consumed fuel at an alarming rate at high power settings. Every minute at maximum speed cost him 3 minutes of patrol time. But if he didn't intercept the bomber quickly, it would reach the target zone. American anti-aircraft gunners would open fire. The bomber might get shot down. Or it might release its bombs. Either way, Smith would have failed. The mathematics of night interception were brutal. Most night fighter missions ended without contact. The sky was enormous. Even with radar, finding a single bomber required perfect coordination between pilot and radar operator. Finding 4 bombers in one night was nearly impossible. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron had scored 18 kills total since arriving in the Pacific Theater. 18 kills in 14 months. Smith already had 4 kills to his name. Adding 4 more in one night would make him the top American night fighter ace of the war. But records didn't matter. What mattered was stopping those bombers. Porter called out corrections. Smith adjusted heading. The second contact grew stronger on the radar scope. Range, 4 miles. 3 miles. 2 miles. Smith spotted the bomber at 1 mile. Another Betty. Same profile. Same vulnerable fuel tanks. The bomber was lower than the first one. 6,000 feet instead of 8,000. Closer to the cloud layer. That gave Smith less room to maneuver. Smith positioned the P-61 below and behind the target. The approach had to be perfect. Too fast and he'd overshoot. Too slow and the bomber might spot him. Night fighters relied on surprise. Once the enemy knew you were there, everything changed. Bomber crews would take evasive action. Gunners would open fire. The clean intercept would turn into a dogfight. At 500 yards, Smith saw the Betty clearly. Dark shape against dark sky. The bomber crew was flying straight and level. No evasive maneuvers. No indication they knew Smith was there. The P-61's black paint made it nearly invisible at night. The engines were quiet compared to most fighters. The Japanese called the P-61 the Black Widow. They feared it. But fear only worked if they knew it was coming. Smith centered the target in his gun sight. Range, 350 yards. He fired. 2-second burst. 48 rounds. The shells tore through the Betty's fuselage. The right engine caught fire immediately. Then the left. Both wings were burning within seconds. The bomber nosed over and dove toward the ocean. Smith watched it fall. It hit the water at 0019. 17 minutes after midnight. 2 bombers down. 10 remaining. But Smith's fuel gauge showed 42% remaining. Porter had 2 more contacts on his scope. Both were closer to Mindoro than the previous targets. Both were at different altitudes. One at 9,000 feet. One at 4,000 feet. And they were 8 miles apart. Smith made a decision. He would take the higher target first. Climbing used less fuel than descending rapidly. But the higher target was also farther north. Pursuing it meant allowing the lower bomber to get closer to the airfields. If Smith made the wrong choice, 1 bomber would get through, and the entire mission would be considered a failure. Smith turned north and climbed. The P-61 reached 9,000 feet at 0023. Porter locked onto the third contact. Range, 7 miles. Heading 160, speed 190 knots. But this bomber was different. It was faster than the Bettys, and it was taking evasive action, turning, changing altitude. Someone aboard that aircraft knew the Americans had night fighters in the area. The third bomber was a Nakajima Ki-49 Donryu. The Americans called it Helen. Faster than the Betty. Maximum speed, 306 miles per hour. Better defensive armament. 5 7.7mm machine guns. The tail gunner had a clear field of fire directly behind the aircraft. Approaching from dead astern would put Smith in the gunner's sights. Smith adjusted his approach. Instead of positioning directly behind the Helen, he came from below and to the left, the bomber's blind spot. Most Japanese bombers had poor ventral coverage. The belly was vulnerable. Smith exploited that weakness. Range decreased to 1 mile. The Helen continued its evasive maneuvers, turning left, then right, climbing 200 feet, descending 300. The pilot was experienced. He understood that straight and level flight made his aircraft an easy target. Random changes in heading and altitude made radar tracking difficult. Porter compensated by predicting the bomber's movements, watching the pattern, anticipating the next turn. Smith closed to 600 yards. The Helen's pilot made a sharp turn to the right. Smith followed. The P-61's twin-boom configuration gave it excellent stability. The aircraft responded smoothly to control inputs. Smith kept the bomber centered in his gun sight. Range 500 yards, 450, 400. At 375 yards, the Helen's tail gunner opened fire. Tracers streaked past Smith's canopy. The gunner had spotted the P-61. The element of surprise was gone. Smith had seconds to take the shot before the bomber pilot initiated aggressive evasive action. He squeezed the trigger. 3-second burst. 72 rounds. Longer than his previous attacks. Necessary because the Helen was maneuvering. The 20mm shells punched through the Helen's fuselage. The right engine exploded. The bomber rolled inverted and entered a spin. Smith pulled away to avoid debris. The burning aircraft fell through 9,000 feet, 8,000, 7,000. It hit the water at 0029, 29 minutes after midnight. 3 bombers down, 9 remaining. But Smith's fuel gauge showed 28%, critical level. Most pilots returned to base at 30% fuel. Below that, any delay could result in a forced landing, or worse. Running out of fuel over open ocean at night meant certain death. No visual references, no way to judge altitude. The aircraft would hit the water before the pilot realized how low he was flying. Porter had one more contact on his scope, the 4th target. Heading 170, altitude 4,000 feet, range 9 miles. This was the bomber Smith had bypassed earlier, the one flying at low altitude. It was now only 12 miles from Mindoro, close enough that Smith could see the searchlights from the American airfields, thin beams of white light sweeping the sky. Anti-aircraft batteries were ready. Gunners had their fingers on triggers, waiting for targets. Smith descended toward the 4th bomber. Diving conserved fuel. The P-61 dropped through 8,000 feet, 7,000, 6,000, 5,000. Smith leveled off at 4,200 feet, slightly above the target. The altitude advantage gave him better position for the attack. He could dive on the bomber from above, use gravity to increase his speed, reduce the time the target had to react. Range 4 miles, 3 miles, 2 miles. Smith acquired the target visually at 1 mile. Another Betty. The bomber was flying straight toward Mindoro. No evasive action. The pilot either didn't know American night fighters were in the area or didn't care. Perhaps he believed his mission was more important than his survival. Japanese bomber crews often accepted death as the price of completing their objectives. Smith positioned the P-61 for the kill, below and behind, 350 yards. He checked his ammunition counter. 512 rounds remaining, enough for 3 more attacks, maybe 4 if he was conservative, but this was the 4th target. He needed to make every shot count. Smith's fuel gauge showed 23%, below safety margins. If he engaged this bomber and missed, he wouldn't have enough fuel to pursue it again. One chance, one burst, then he had to return to base. Whether the bomber was destroyed or still flying, Smith fired at 0034, 2-second burst, 48 rounds. The 20mm shells converged on the Betty's center fuselage. The bomber's port wing separated from the aircraft. Fuel tanks ruptured. Fire spread across the remaining wing structure. The Betty rolled left and dove toward the ocean. It impacted at 0035, 35 minutes after midnight. 4 bombers destroyed in 55 minutes. Smith turned the P-61 back toward Mindoro. His fuel gauge showed 21%. The mathematical calculation was simple. McGuire Field was 18 miles south. The Black Widow consumed approximately 100 gallons per hour at cruise speed. Smith had roughly 60 gallons remaining. At cruise speed, he could fly for another 36 minutes, more than enough to reach the airfield, unless something went wrong. Porter scanned his radar scope for additional contacts. Nothing. The remaining 8 Japanese bombers had turned back. Whether they detected Smith's attacks or simply lost their nerve was irrelevant. The mission was accomplished. 4 kills, 0 American casualties. The airfields were safe. Construction crews would work through the night without interruption. The Lingayen Gulf invasion schedule remained intact, but Smith's night wasn't over. At 0042, Porter detected a new contact, heading north, range 4 miles, altitude 7,000 feet. Smith checked his position. He was 12 miles from McGuire Field, fuel at 19%. The contact was between Smith and his base. If it was a Japanese bomber, it was heading toward the airfields Smith had just defended. Engaging it would consume more fuel, possibly too much fuel. Smith might not make it back to base. The alternative was worse, letting a Japanese bomber reach Mindoro unchallenged. Smith had destroyed 4 aircraft. If a 5th bomber got through and killed American personnel, the entire night's work would be tainted. Numbers didn't matter if someone died, because Smith prioritized his own survival over mission completion. Smith turned toward the contact. Porter called vectors. The range closed rapidly. 3 miles, 2 miles, 1 mile. Smith acquired the target visually at 800 yards. It wasn't a bomber. It was a Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate. The Americans called it Frank. A single-engine fighter, maximum speed 392 miles per hour, 4 12.7mm machine guns, 2 20mm cannons, one of the best Japanese fighters in service. The Frank was faster than the P-61, more maneuverable, better rate of climb. In daylight, a skilled Frank pilot could outfight a Black Widow. But this wasn't daylight, and the Frank pilot had no radar. He was flying blind, searching for American aircraft using visual references that didn't exist in complete darkness. Smith had one advantage. The Frank pilot didn't know Smith was there. Smith positioned the P-61 below and behind the fighter. Range 500 yards. The approach was identical to his bomber intercepts. Get close, fire, confirm the kill. But fighters were smaller targets, harder to hit, and the Frank had armor protection around the cockpit and engine. A 2-second burst might not be enough. Smith closed to 300 yards. His fuel gauge showed 17%. If he missed this shot, he wouldn't have time for a second attempt. He would have to disengage immediately and hope he had enough fuel to reach McGuire Field. Missing the shot also meant the Frank would know American night fighters were in the area. The element of surprise would be lost. Future intercepts would be more difficult. Smith centered the Frank in his gun sight. His finger rested on the trigger. The mathematics were clear. Engaging the fighter would drop his fuel to 15%, below minimum safety margin. But letting it go meant risking American lives on the ground. The P-61's engines hummed steadily at 320 miles per hour. The Frank flew straight and level, unaware it was being hunted. Smith made his decision at 0045. He squeezed the trigger. 3-second burst, 72 rounds, the longest burst of the night. The shells tore through the Frank's tail section and engine cowling. The Frank's engine burst into flames. Black smoke poured from the cowling. The fighter rolled right and dove. Smith watched it descend through 7,000 feet, 6,000, 5,000. The flames grew larger. At 3,000 feet, the pilot ejected. Smith saw the parachute open, a white canopy against black sky. The Frank continued its dive and hit the water at 0046. Smith checked his fuel gauge, 15%. The engagement had consumed more fuel than calculated. McGuire Field was 11 miles south. The P-61's fuel consumption at cruise speed meant Smith had approximately 22 minutes of flight time remaining, enough to reach the airfield with minimal reserves. But any headwind or navigation error would exhaust his fuel before landing. Porter guided Smith toward Mindoro using radar navigation. The island appeared on the scope as a large landmass. McGuire Field was on the southwestern coast. The airfield had been operational for only 4 days. Minimal lighting, no instrument landing system. Pilots landing at night relied on a single row of kerosene lamps marking the runway. From 5 miles out, those lamps looked like dim yellow dots, easy to miss in darkness. Smith descended to 2,000 feet. His fuel gauge showed 13%. The P-61's fuel tanks held 646 gallons total. 13% meant 84 gallons remaining. At cruise power settings, that provided 18 minutes of flight time. Smith was 8 miles from the airfield. At 280 miles per hour, That meant approximately 1.7 minutes to reach the landing pattern. Enough fuel. Barely. At 00:52, Smith spotted the runway lights. 12 dim lamps arranged in a line. The runway was 5,000 feet long. Crushed coral surface. Engineers had completed construction on December 26th, the same day the 418th Night Fighter Squadron arrived. The runway was adequate for P-61 operations, but lacked the safety features of established airfields. No overrun area, no crash barriers. If Smith landed too fast or too slow, the aircraft would leave the runway. At night, with minimal lighting, any landing error would likely be fatal. Smith entered the landing pattern at 1,000 feet. His fuel gauge showed 11%, 57 gallons. The P-61 consumed fuel faster during landing approach. Power settings fluctuated. Engines spooled up during turns, spooled down during descents. Each power change consumed additional fuel. Smith calculated he had approximately 12 minutes of fuel remaining, more than enough to land, unless something went wrong. At 00:55, something went wrong. The runway lights went out. All 12 lamps extinguished simultaneously. Complete darkness. Smith was 3 miles from the runway. Altitude, 800 feet. Airspeed, 140 knots. Without runway lights, he had no visual reference for landing. The P-61 would hit the ground before Smith realized how low he was flying. Porter suggested using the radar altimeter. The device measured height above ground by bouncing radio waves off the surface, accurate to within 50 feet. Smith could descend slowly using the altimeter and dead reckoning navigation. When the altimeter showed 0 feet, he would be on the ground. The technique was dangerous. Any error in navigation meant landing off the runway, hitting trees, or coral reefs, or construction equipment. Smith's fuel gauge showed 9%, 46 gallons, 8 minutes of flight time, not enough to divert to another airfield. Taqlabad on Leyte was the nearest alternative, 90 miles northeast. The P-61 would run out of fuel 40 miles short. Smith had one option: land at McGuire Field without runway lights, or crash into the ocean and hope someone rescued him before he drowned. The decision was simple. Smith had survived 4 intercepts, 5 kills in 55 minutes, the highest single-night total for any American night fighter pilot in the Pacific Theater. He had saved American lives on the ground, protected the airfields, enabled the Lingayen Gulf invasion to proceed on schedule. Dying now because of extinguished runway lights would make the entire mission meaningless. Smith turned the P-61 toward where he believed the runway was located. His altitude was 600 feet, fuel at 9%, and the darkness below was absolute. Smith descended to 400 feet. The radar altimeter showed 380 feet above ground level. He reduced airspeed to 120 knots. The P-61's stall speed was 95 knots with flaps fully extended. Flying at 120 knots gave Smith a 25-knot safety margin, not much. But descending slower would consume more fuel. The mathematics were unforgiving. Porter monitored the radar scope. The coastline of Mindoro showed clearly. McGuire Field was inland, approximately 1 mile from the beach. Smith used compass heading to navigate. The runway ran north-south. Smith approached from the north. His heading was 180 degrees. If his navigation was accurate, the runway would be directly ahead. If not, he would land in jungle, or construction areas, or coral reefs. At 00:58, Smith extended the landing gear. 3 green indicator lights confirmed all 3 wheels were down and locked. Main gear under each engine nacelle. Nose gear under the forward fuselage. The P-61's landing gear was robust, designed to handle rough airfields. But landing without visual references meant Smith couldn't judge his touchdown point. He might hit too hard. Collapse the gear. The aircraft would cartwheel. At 120 knots, the crew would not survive. Smith's fuel gauge showed 7%, 36 gallons, 5 minutes remaining. He extended flaps to full. The P-61's airspeed decreased to 110 knots. The aircraft descended at 300 feet per minute. The radar altimeter showed 250 feet, 200, 150. Smith couldn't see the ground. No lights, no visual references, just instruments and the hope that his navigation was correct. At 100 feet altitude, Smith reduced power. The descent rate increased to 400 feet per minute, faster than normal, but necessary to reach the ground before his fuel ran out. 75 feet, 50 feet, 25 feet. Smith prepared for touchdown. His hands gripped the control column. His feet rested on the rudder pedals, ready to correct for any deviation. The P-61's main wheels hit crushed coral at 0059. The impact was harder than normal. Smith felt the jolt through the airframe, but the landing gear held. The nose wheel touched down 3 seconds later. Smith applied brakes. The P-61 decelerated rapidly. 100 knots, 80, 60, 40. The aircraft slowed to taxi speed at 20 knots. Smith couldn't see where he was on the runway. He kept the brakes applied until the P-61 stopped completely. His fuel gauge showed 6%, 29 gallons, 3 minutes of fuel remaining. Ground crew arrived with flashlights. They guided Smith to the parking area. The P-61's engines shut down at 0103, 1 hour and 3 minutes after takeoff. Smith climbed out of the cockpit. His legs were stiff. His hands were shaking. Not from fear, from exhaustion. 5 intercepts, 5 kills, 1 blind landing, all in 63 minutes of combat. Porter climbed out from the radar operator's compartment. He had tracked 5 targets successfully, vectored Smith to each intercept, maintained radar contact throughout the engagement. Without Porter's skill, none of the kills would have been possible. Night fighting was a team effort. Pilot and radar operator working in perfect coordination. The ground crew inspected the P-61. No damage. All 4 cannons had functioned correctly. Total ammunition expended, 408 rounds. Smith had started the mission with 800 rounds. He landed with 392 rounds remaining, enough ammunition for 2 more intercepts, but 0 fuel for pursuing additional targets. Intelligence officers arrived at 0115. They wanted details, times, locations, altitudes, aircraft types. Smith provided the information from memory. 4 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers, 1 Nakajima Ki-49 Helen bomber, 1 Nakajima Ki-84 Frank fighter, all destroyed between 2357 on December 29th and 0046 on December 30th. Total engagement time, 49 minutes. The intelligence officers confirmed the kills through multiple sources. Ground radar had tracked the intercepts. Coast watchers reported seeing aircraft crash into the ocean. Wreckage was visible at first light. 4 bombers, 1 fighter, all exactly where Smith reported. 4 kills in one night equaled the record for American night fighters, but Smith wasn't finished. On December 30th, 1944, at 14:30 hours, Smith flew his second mission of the day. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft had been spotted over Mindoro, single-engine fighters, faster than bombers, more difficult to intercept. Smith and Porter took off in the same P-61. The aircraft had been refueled and rearmed. 800 rounds of 20mm ammunition, 646 gallons of fuel. At 1512, Porter detected a contact, heading north, altitude 12,000 feet, range 8 miles. Smith climbed to intercept. The target was another Nakajima Ki-84 Frank fighter, faster than the P-61 in level flight, but Smith had altitude advantage. He dove on the Frank from above. The diving attack increased his speed to 390 miles per hour, faster than the Frank's maximum level speed. Smith fired at 400 yards. 2-second burst, 48 rounds. The Frank's engine exploded. The fighter rolled inverted and dove into the ocean. Smith's 7th kill. The final victory made him the top-scoring American night fighter ace of World War II. 7 confirmed kills, all achieved in less than 24 hours of combat flying. No other American night fighter pilot in any theater would match that total. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron continued operations from Mindoro through January 1945. The unit scored 18 total kills during the war, the highest total of any P-61 squadron in the Pacific Theater. Smith's 7 kills accounted for 39% of the squadron's total score. Porter received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his role as radar operator. His skill made every intercept possible. The P-61 Times-a-Wastin continued flying combat missions through May 1945. The aircraft survived the war undamaged. After VJ Day, It was scrapped along with most Black Widows. Only 4 P-61s exist today. None of them is Smith's aircraft. The nose art. The kill markings. The aircraft that hunted 4 bombers in 80 minutes. All lost to history. McGuire Field supported the Lingayen Gulf invasion as planned. American forces landed on January 9, 1945. P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts, operating from Mindoro, provided air cover. The airfield Smith defended on December 29th enabled that air cover. Engineers estimated that Japanese bombs hitting the construction areas would have delayed airfield completion by 2 weeks. 2 weeks meant the invasion would have been delayed. Casualties would have mounted. The war would have lasted longer. Smith survived the war. He returned to the United States in February 1946, left the military, became a civilian, never sought publicity, never wrote memoirs. The only records of his achievement exist in military archives, unit histories, intelligence reports, the dry documentation of kills confirmed and missions accomplished. The P-61 Black Widow proved what night fighters could achieve. 700 aircraft built, used in every theater: European, Pacific, China, Burma, India, Mediterranean. The aircraft dominated night combat from 1944 through 1945. After the war, the P-61 was redesignated F-61, continued service until 1954, then retired, replaced by jet-powered night fighters with better performance. But in December 1944, over Mindoro, the Black Widow was the most advanced night fighter in the world, and Carol Smith was the best pilot flying it. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about pilots who saved lives with radar. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching. And thank you for making sure Major Carol Smith doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.
March 23rd, 1957, Groton, Connecticut. USS Seawolf lies pierside at the Electric Boat Company shipyard, steam venting from relief valves, the smell of hot metal and ozone heavy in the air. Inside the reactor compartment, technicians in protective clothing monitor gauges that are climbing toward operating parameters no American submarine has ever approached. The reactor is designated S2G, a sodium-cooled liquid metal fast breeder design that Admiral Hyman Rickover, the father of the nuclear navy, believes represents the future of submarine propulsion. Unlike the pressurized water reactor in USS Nautilus, the world's first nuclear submarine, commissioned 3 years earlier, the S2G uses liquid sodium as coolant instead of water. Sodium transfers heat more efficiently than water. It operates at atmospheric pressure rather than requiring massive pressure vessels. And theoretically, it generates more power per pound of uranium, allowing submarines to achieve higher speeds and longer operating durations between refuelings. But sodium has a problem. It ignites spontaneously when exposed to air or water. A leak in the sodium cooling system does not create a steam explosion like a pressurized water reactor. It creates a chemical fire that cannot be extinguished with water and burns at temperatures exceeding 1000 degrees Fahrenheit. The S2G reactor contains approximately 100,000 pounds of liquid sodium circulating through primary and secondary cooling loops. The sodium must be maintained above 208 degrees Fahrenheit, its melting point, or it solidifies, blocking coolant flow and causing reactor overheating. The system includes electric trace heating throughout every pipe, valve, and component to prevent solidification. Superheaters, devices that raise steam temperature above saturation point, are constructed from rolled steel rather than forged steel, a cost-saving decision that will prove catastrophic. And the entire system is sealed inside a containment vessel designed to prevent sodium from contacting water in the event of a leak. The complexity exceeds anything the Navy has attempted. The margin for error is zero. Seawolf is the second nuclear submarine ever commissioned by the United States Navy, entering service on March 30, 1957. She displaces 3,400 tons submerged, measures 267 feet in length, and is powered exclusively by the S2G reactor, driving a single shaft. Her mission is to prove that liquid metal reactor technology is viable for submarine operations and superior to the pressurized water reactors used in Nautilus. But from the moment Seawolf begins sea trials, the S2G reactor demonstrates problems that range from irritating to life-threatening. The superheaters fail repeatedly, forcing operation at reduced power. Sodium leaks develop in welds that were inadequately inspected during construction. Corrosion appears in piping exposed to sodium at high temperatures. And the trace heating system, critical for preventing sodium solidification, consumes so much electrical power that the submarine's auxiliary systems are starved when the reactor operates at low power levels. On August 7, 1958, Seawolf departs New London, Connecticut, for what will become a record-setting patrol. 60 consecutive days submerged without surfacing, covering more than 13,700 nautical miles. The patrol is designed to demonstrate the endurance of nuclear-powered submarines and the reliability of the S2G reactor under sustained operations. Seawolf transits the Atlantic, participates in NATO exercises near Europe, and returns to Newport, Rhode Island, surfacing on October 6, 1958, having broken every submerged endurance record previously established. The crew is exhausted. The submarine smells of amine from the carbon dioxide scrubbers, hydraulic oil from machinery, and the metallic tang of recycled air. But the reactor has functioned, barely. The superheaters operated intermittently, sodium leaks were detected and temporarily patched, and the engineering crew worked rotating shifts to monitor systems that could not be trusted to operate without constant attention. Admiral Rickover reviews the patrol reports and makes a decision that ends the liquid metal reactor program. The S2G will be replaced. The complexity, the maintenance burden, the safety risks, and the operational limitations outweigh any theoretical performance advantages. On December 12, 1958, Seawolf returns to Electric Boat in Groton for conversion from a sodium-cooled reactor to a pressurized water reactor, designated S2WA, essentially a spare reactor from the Nautilus program. The conversion requires cutting through the pressure hull, removing the entire reactor compartment, disposing of the radioactive S2G reactor, installing the replacement S2WA reactor, re-welding the pressure hull, and conducting sea trials to certify the submarine is safe to operate. The process will take nearly 2 years. Seawolf is placed out of commission on December 12, 1958, and will not return to service until September 30, 1960. But what happens to the S2G reactor is a story that will not be fully disclosed for decades. The reactor cannot be stored at a naval facility. The sodium coolant is chemically reactive and radioactive. The components are contaminated with fission products from 2 years of operation. And no protocol exists for long-term storage of a sodium-cooled nuclear reactor because no one anticipated needing one. Seawolf was supposed to be the first of many sodium-cooled submarines, not the only one. The Atomic Energy Commission and the Navy decide on a solution that is expedient, controversial, and ultimately irresponsible: ocean disposal. On April 18, 1959, the S2G reactor, complete with its sodium coolant, contaminated piping, and radioactive core components, is sealed inside a 30-foot-high stainless steel containment vessel. The vessel is welded shut, tested for leaks, and placed on a barge. The barge is towed approximately 120 nautical miles due east of Maryland to a location where water depth exceeds 9,000 feet. At the designated coordinates, valves are opened, ballast tanks are flooded, and the barge sinks. The containment vessel descends through 3 miles of water and impacts the ocean floor at a location recorded in Navy disposal logs. The reactor, containing several hundred pounds of fissile material, thousands of curies of radioactive contamination, and 100,000 pounds of chemically reactive sodium, is abandoned on the seabed with the assumption that the stainless steel containment will remain intact longer than the radioactive materials take to decay to safe levels. 21 years later, in 1980, the Navy attempts to relocate the reactor as part of an environmental assessment. Using the coordinates from 1959 disposal records and side-scan sonar, Navy survey vessels search the seabed. They do not find the containment vessel. The ocean floor at that depth is not flat. It is a landscape of sediment plains, abyssal hills, and canyons where currents can shift objects weighing tons. The reactor could be buried under sediment. It could have rolled into a depression not visible from the surface. Or the disposal coordinates recorded in 1959 could be inaccurate, placing the reactor miles from where the Navy believes it to be. The Navy issues a statement acknowledging they cannot find the reactor, but assuring the public that the containment vessel will remain intact for centuries, and that the radioactive materials will decay before the steel corrodes. The statement is not entirely reassuring. The reactor remains lost somewhere on the Atlantic seabed, its exact location unknown, its condition uncertain, and its long-term environmental impact unknowable. If you are enjoying this investigation into history's hidden conflicts, please verify your subscription to the channel Cold War Chronicles. We declassify the past to understand the present. USS Seawolf returns to service on September 30th, 1960, with a conventional pressurized water reactor replacing the experimental sodium system. The submarine operates as an attack boat along the East Coast, conducting training exercises, participating in NATO operations, and deploying to the Mediterranean. She performs adequately but unremarkably. The crew that operates her after 1960 knows nothing about the sodium reactor. The conversion has erased the physical evidence of the S2G's existence, and the Navy does not advertise the failure of Rickover's experimental reactor program. Seawolf becomes another attack submarine in a growing fleet of nuclear boats, distinguished only by the engineers and historians who know her history. But in November 1970, Seawolf receives new orders: transit to the West Coast and report to Submarine Force Pacific Fleet for reassignment to Special CERN operations. The submarine transits the Panama Canal on November 17, 1970, and arrives at Mare Island Naval Shipyard in Vallejo, California. On March 24, 1971, Seawolf enters dry dock for conversion to a Special Projects platform, the Navy's designation for submarines conducting covert intelligence operations. The conversion is comprehensive and classified. Seawolf's bow is lengthened by approximately 15 feet to accommodate additional berthing for civilian technicians, electronics equipment for signals, intelligence collection, and storage for specialized gear. A fish, a towed sonar, and camera platform similar to the one used by USS Halibut is installed, along with winches, cables, and handling equipment. A diver lockout chamber is added, allowing saturation divers to exit the submarine at depth and conduct underwater operations. And skids, external structures that allow the submarine to rest on the ocean floor without damaging the hull, are welded to the keel. The skids are critical for a specific type of mission, hovering on the seabed in shallow water near enemy installations, remaining stationary for hours or days while conducting intelligence collection operations. Conventional submarines cannot rest on the bottom safely because their hulls are not designed to support the submarine's weight when not buoyed by water. The pressure hull can buckle, external sensors can be damaged, and maneuvering to leave the bottom requires significant power and time, during which the submarine is vulnerable. But with skids, Seawolf can settle onto the seabed, reduce reactor power to minimum levels, minimize acoustic signature, and wait, listening to enemy communications, photographing coastal installations, or monitoring submarine traffic, before rising and withdrawing. The conversion is completed in March 1973. Seawolf emerges as a submarine unlike any other attack boat in the fleet. She is slower than conventional Los Angeles-class submarines. She carries fewer weapons. Her crew includes sailors with security clearances far above standard submarine ratings. And her missions are described only as special operations, a euphemism that covers cable tapping, retrieval of test missiles from deep water, reconnaissance of enemy naval bases, and placement of underwater intelligence collection devices in locations that cannot be disclosed. Seawolf conducts multiple deployments to the Western Pacific, operating in areas where Soviet submarines transit, where undersea communication cables connect Soviet naval facilities, and where acoustic intelligence can be gathered without Soviet knowledge. One mission, details of which remain partially classified, involves Seawolf resting on the seabed in shallow water near a Soviet installation, positioned to intercept communications or photograph submarine movements. The exact location is not disclosed in declassified records. The duration of the bottom time is not specified. But what happens during that mission illustrates the razor-thin margin between success and disaster in submarine intelligence operations. Seawolf settles onto the bottom using her skids, achieving stable contact with the seabed at a depth between 200 and 300 feet. The submarine reduces reactor power, decreases ventilation flow to minimize noise, and begins intelligence collection. Hours pass. The crew operates in ultra-quiet mode. No unnecessary movement, no equipment operation beyond essential systems, no communication with shore stations that might generate detectable transmissions. The mission proceeds as planned. Intelligence is collected. And then the submarine attempts to leave the bottom. The ballast control team initiates procedures to achieve positive buoyancy, blow air into main ballast tanks, displace seawater, reduce the submarine's weight until she becomes buoyant and rises from the seabed. The procedure is routine, but when the order is given to surface, Seawolf does not move. The submarine remains on the bottom. Additional air is blown into the tanks. Still no movement. The diving officer orders emergency blow, maximum air pressure into all ballast tanks simultaneously. Seawolf shudders but does not rise. She is stuck. The cause is suction. When a large, flat object rests on a soft seabed, sediment, mud, fine sand, water is displaced from between the object and the bottom. As time passes, sediment settles around the edges, creating a seal. When the object attempts to rise, suction holds it down. The force can be enormous, thousands of pounds per square foot. Submarines are not designed to overcome suction because they are not supposed to rest on the bottom for extended periods. Seawolf's skids allow her to land safely, but they also create large, flat contact areas that maximize suction. The captain orders the propeller engaged at minimal power to create forward thrust. The submarine rocks slightly, but does not break free. More power is applied. The propeller churns sediment, creating a visible disturbance on the surface, directly above Seawolf's position. And on the surface, a Soviet trawler, one of many that patrol near Soviet installations specifically to detect American submarine activity, observes the disturbance. The trawler alters course toward the anomaly. Seawolf is about to be detected. The Soviet trawler is not a fishing vessel in the conventional sense. It is an intelligence collection platform designated an AGI, Auxiliary General Intelligence, equipped with radar, direction-finding equipment, acoustic sensors, and communications intercept capability. The Soviet Navy operates dozens of these trawlers, positioning them near American naval bases, along submarine transit routes, and in areas where American submarines are suspected to conduct covert operations. The trawlers are slow, unarmed, and crewed by sailors trained in intelligence gathering rather than combat. But they are persistent, and when a trawler detects anomalous activity, a disturbance on the surface, unusual acoustic signatures, or evidence of submarine operations, it reports immediately to Soviet naval headquarters, which can dispatch patrol aircraft, surface warships, or submarines to investigate. The trawler observes the sediment plume rising to the surface directly above Seawolf's position. The disturbance is not natural. Ocean currents do not generate localized sediment clouds in deep water far from shore. The trawler alters course toward the anomaly and reduces speed, positioning itself to observe. On the bridge, the crew takes photographs and records the location. Below deck, communications equipment transmits an encrypted message to Soviet naval headquarters. Possible American submarine activity detected at specific coordinates. Observation continuing. Aboard Seawolf, the sonar operator reports the trawler's approach. Passive sonar detects the trawler's propeller signature, a diesel engine driving a single screw at low speed. The acoustic signature, consistent with a fishing trawler, but the course and speed inconsistent with fishing operations. The trawler is not deploying nets. It is not maneuvering in patterns typical of commercial fishing. It is holding station directly above Seawolf, waiting. The captain faces a decision with no good options. Seawolf cannot remain on the bottom indefinitely. The reactor is operating at minimum power, but even minimum power generates heat that must be dissipated through seawater circulating through heat exchangers. If the submarine remains on the bottom for extended periods, the heat exchangers can become clogged with sediment stirred up by the propeller. Clogged heat exchangers reduce cooling efficiency, forcing the reactor to reduce power further or risk overheating. Reduced reactor power limits the submarine's ability to operate propulsion, hotel systems, and emergency equipment. And if the reactor shuts down, a scram, restarting it underwater while stuck on the bottom, is extraordinarily difficult and potentially impossible. The captain orders another attempt to break free using propeller thrust. The engineering officer brings the reactor to higher power, generating steam for the turbines that drive the propeller shaft. The propeller engages at increasing speed, churning sediment, creating forward thrust. Seawolf rocks. The suction holding her down resists. The propeller digs deeper into the sediment, throwing more material upward toward the surface. And on the surface, the Soviet trawler observes the disturbance intensifying. Then something breaks. The underbelly gondola, the external structure containing the retractable skids, additional equipment and sensors, tears free from the hull. The gondola is not part of the pressure hull. It is bolted and welded to the keel as an external appendage. When Seawolf applies maximum propeller thrust while the skids are stuck in the seabed, the forces exceed the structural limits of the attachments. Welds fail, bolts shear, and the gondola rips away, remaining embedded in the sediment as Seawolf breaks free and rises from the bottom. But the loss of the gondola creates a catastrophic problem: noise. The gondola contained fairings, covers, and structures that streamlined water flow around equipment mounted on the keel. With the gondola gone, that equipment is exposed to water flow. Loose components, cables, sensor housings, fragments of torn metal bang against the hull as the submarine moves. The noise is loud enough to be heard inside the pressure hull, and it is loud enough to be detected by the Soviet trawler's passive acoustic sensors. Seawolf is no longer a stealthy submarine. She is a noisy target broadcasting her position to any listener within miles. The captain orders ahead flank, maximum speed, and alters course toward international waters. The submarine accelerates through 15 knots, 20 knots, approaching 30 knots submerged. The noise from the damaged keel increases with speed. Metal components vibrate. Water flow generates turbulence, and the Soviet trawler, maintaining contact, follows. The trawler cannot match Seawolf's submerged speed, but it does not need to. Soviet procedures dictate that when a trawler detects American submarine activity, it maintains contact for as long as possible while transmitting updates to headquarters. Soviet patrol aircraft can be dispatched within hours. Surface warships can converge on the area, and Soviet submarines, if positioned nearby, can be directed to intercept. The trawler's role is not to capture the American submarine. Its role is to maintain contact long enough for other assets to arrive. Seawolf transits at maximum speed for over 2 hours, covering more than 60 nautical miles. The sonar operator monitors the trawler. which continues following at its maximum speed of approximately 12 knots, falling progressively behind, but maintaining intermittent contact using passive sonar to track the noise from Seawolf's damaged keel. The submarine crosses into international waters, beyond the 12 nautical mile territorial limit claimed by the Soviet Union, but the trawler does not break contact. International waters do not prevent Soviet vessels from observing American submarines. They only prevent Soviet forces from legally boarding or seizing them. But Seawolf has an advantage: endurance. The trawler is diesel-powered with limited fuel capacity. It cannot sustain high-speed pursuit indefinitely. Seawolf, nuclear-powered, can operate at maximum speed for days if necessary, limited only by the crew's endurance and the mechanical stress on equipment. The captain maintains flank speed, accepting the damage being done to machinery that is being pushed beyond design limits, prioritizing escape over equipment preservation. After 6 hours of pursuit, the sonar operator reports the trawler is no longer in contact. The trawler has either exhausted its fuel, abandoned the pursuit, or lost acoustic contact due to range and environmental conditions. Seawolf continues transiting for another 12 hours before reducing speed and conducting damage assessment. The gondola is gone. The keel-mounted equipment is damaged. The noise signature is compromised. And the mission, whatever intelligence was collected while Seawolf sat on the seabed, has been compromised by Soviet detection. Seawolf returns to her home port in Bangor, Washington, in October 1981. The submarine is awarded the Navy Expeditionary Medal for the deployment, though the citation provides no details about the mission or the incident in Soviet waters. The damage assessment reveals that repairing the keel and restoring stealth capability will require months of shipyard work. The underbelly gondola must be rebuilt. The skids must be redesigned to prevent future failures, and the noise-generating equipment exposed by the gondola loss must be repaired or replaced. But the larger question is whether Seawolf's covert operations capability has been permanently compromised. Soviet intelligence now knows that American submarines can rest on the seabed for extended periods using retractable skids. They know the approximate location where Seawolf was operating, and they have acoustic recordings of Seawolf's noise signature when damaged, which can be analyzed to develop tactics for detecting similar submarines in the future. The advantage of surprise, the ability to place a submarine on the bottom in shallow water without Soviet knowledge, has been lost. The Navy conducts an after-action review of the mission. The findings are classified, but the conclusions are clear. Seabed intelligence collection operations carry risks that exceed those of conventional submarine patrols. Suction can trap submarines on the bottom. Storms can generate surface conditions severe enough to affect submarines even at depth, causing skids to dig into sediment or reactors to ingest sand through heat exchangers. And the mechanical complexity of specialized equipment, gondolas, retractable skids, diver lockout chambers, creates failure modes that do not exist on conventional attack submarines. Despite the incident, Seawolf continues special operations missions throughout the 1980s. The submarine is repaired, the gondola is rebuilt, and deployments resume. But the missions are conducted with greater caution. Bottom time is reduced. Locations are chosen with more attention to seabed composition, and contingency procedures for equipment failure are revised based on lessons learned from the 1981 incident. The intelligence value of Seawolf's operations during this period is assessed as significant. Cable tapping missions in the Sea of Okhotsk and other locations provide communications intercepts that inform strategic assessments of Soviet submarine capabilities, patrol schedules, and operational doctrine. Reconnaissance missions photograph Soviet naval installations, document submarine movements, and collect acoustic signatures used to improve American sonar classification systems. And retrieval missions recover test weapons, torpedoes, missiles, and other ordnance from deep water, allowing American engineers to analyze Soviet technology and identify vulnerabilities. But the operational tempo takes a toll on the submarine and crew. Seawolf is operating equipment that is being pushed beyond original design specifications. The reactor, though replaced with a conventional pressurized water system in 1960, is now approaching the end of its service life. The pressure hull, subjected to thousands of dive cycles, shows signs of metal fatigue. And the specialized equipment, the fish, the diver lockout chamber, the keel-mounted sensors, requires maintenance that exceeds the capacity of forward-deployed repair facilities. In April 1986, Seawolf conducts her final Western Pacific deployment. The mission is routine: surveillance, reconnaissance, intelligence collection. But the submarine shows her age. Mechanical failures occur with increasing frequency. Equipment that should function reliably requires constant attention. And the crew, though highly trained, is exhausted by the demands of operating a submarine that is nearing the end of its operational life. Seawolf returns to Mare Island Naval Shipyard in June 1986 to prepare for decommissioning. The decision has been made. The submarine will not undergo the extensive refueling and overhaul that would extend her service life. The cost of refueling the reactor, approaching $200 million, combined with the age of the pressure hull and the availability of newer submarines designed specifically for special operations, makes decommissioning the economically rational choice. USS Parche, a Sturgeon-class submarine converted to special operations configuration in the 1970s, has assumed the cable tapping and covert reconnaissance missions that Seawolf pioneered. And USS Jimmy Carter, a Seawolf-class submarine, with a 100-foot hull extension for mission equipment, is under construction and will enter service in 2005 as the next-generation spy submarine. On March 30, 1987, USS Seawolf is decommissioned in a ceremony at Mare Island. The crew is dispersed to other submarines, the nuclear fuel is removed, the reactor is defueled and secured, and Seawolf is placed in storage, awaiting entry into the ship submarine recycling program that will systematically dismantle her. The decommissioning ceremony includes no public acknowledgement of Seawolf's intelligence operations. The Navy does not disclose the cable tapping missions, the seabed reconnaissance operations, or the incident in 1981 when the submarine was trapped on the bottom and detected by a Soviet trawler. The crew members who participated in those missions are bound by security oaths that prevent them from discussing operational details, and the intelligence assessments that evaluate the value of the information collected remain classified. But the legacy of USS Seawolf extends beyond the specific missions she conducted. The submarine demonstrated that seabed intelligence collection is feasible but risky. She proved that specialized equipment, skids, gondolas, diver lockout chambers, can be integrated into nuclear submarines, though at the cost of increased complexity and vulnerability to failure. And she established operational procedures for covert missions in contested waters that inform the design and employment of subsequent spy submarines. Seawolf enters the ship submarine recycling program on October 1, 1996. The process, which takes 1 year, involves cutting the hull into sections, removing all equipment, and disposing of materials according to environmental regulations. The reactor compartment is cut out intact, sealed in a steel and concrete casing, and transported by barge to the Hanford site in Washington state, where it joins dozens of other reactor compartments in long-term storage. The non-radioactive sections of the hull are cut into pieces and sold as scrap metal. By September 30, 1997, USS Seawolf no longer exists as a physical object. She has been reduced to documentation, declassified records that provide fragments of her operational history and the memories of crew members who cannot speak publicly about what they witnessed. The story of USS Seawolf is defined by two parallel narratives: the failure of experimental technology and the success of covert intelligence operations. The S2G sodium-cooled reactor represented the Navy's attempt to develop propulsion systems superior to the pressurized water reactors that Rickover had standardized across the nuclear submarine fleet. Sodium coolant offered theoretical advantages: higher thermal efficiency, lower operating pressure, better power-to-weight ratios. But the practical challenges overwhelmed those advantages. The sodium ignited on contact with air or water, requiring elaborate containment systems. The superheaters corroded and leaked. The trace heating consumed excessive electrical power, and the maintenance burden exceeded the capacity of submarine crews to manage safely. When the S2G reactor was removed in 1958 and disposed of in the Atlantic Ocean, it ended not just Seawolf's experimental phase, but the entire liquid metal reactor program for submarines. The Navy never built another sodium-cooled submarine reactor. The decision to dump the S2G reactor at sea reflects the limited options available in 1959 for disposing of radioactive materials that were also chemically reactive. Land-based storage would have required constructing specialized facilities capable of maintaining the sodium above its melting point indefinitely, a technical challenge that no one wanted to undertake. Chemical neutralization of the sodium would have required draining the reactor and exposing it to controlled reactions with water or other agents, generating enormous quantities of radioactive waste and hydrogen gas in processes that were dangerous and expensive. Ocean disposal, by contrast, was simple. Seal the reactor in a container, tow it offshore, sink it in deep water, and assume the ocean would isolate it from the environment long enough for the radioactivity to decay. The assumption proved optimistic. The failure to relocate the reactor in 1980 demonstrates that ocean disposal creates problems that persist for decades. Lost radioactive materials, unknown environmental impacts, and the possibility that future generations will face consequences from decisions made in haste by predecessors who did not fully understand the long-term implications. The environmental legacy of the S2G reactor remains uncertain. The containment vessel was designed to remain intact for centuries, but stainless steel corrodes in seawater, particularly at the pressures and temperatures of the deep ocean. If the containment fails, the sodium inside will react with seawater, generating sodium hydroxide, a caustic compound, and hydrogen gas. The reaction will release radioactive contamination into the surrounding water, where it can be dispersed by ocean currents, absorbed by sediment, or taken up by marine organisms. The radioactive isotopes in the reactor include cesium-137, strontium-90, and various transuranic elements that remain hazardous for centuries. Whether those isotopes are currently contained within the steel vessel or have already leaked into the environment is unknown because the Navy cannot find the reactor. The broader pattern of ocean disposal during the Cold War includes not just Seawolf's reactor, but dozens of other radioactive objects dumped at sea by both the United States and the Soviet Union. Between 1946 and 1970, the United States disposed of approximately 47,000 containers of radioactive waste in the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, plus naval reactors, contaminated equipment, and damaged submarines. The Soviet Union dumped even larger quantities, including entire reactor compartments from decommissioned submarines in the Kara Sea and other Arctic waters. International agreements eventually prohibited ocean disposal of radioactive materials, but the legacy of previous dumping persists. The materials remain on the seabed, slowly corroding, and the long-term environmental consequences will not be known until monitoring programs, which are limited by the difficulty of surveying deep ocean environments, detect evidence of contamination. The second phase of Seawolf's career, her conversion to a spy submarine, and her participation in covert intelligence operations, demonstrates the value and risks of submarine espionage during the Cold War. The missions conducted between 1973 and 1987 provided intelligence that informed American strategic assessments of Soviet submarine capabilities, deployment patterns, and operational procedures. Cable tapping operations intercepted communications between Soviet naval headquarters and submarine bases, revealing patrol schedules, maintenance issues, and tactical discussions that could not be obtained through other collection methods. Reconnaissance missions photographed Soviet naval installations, documented submarine movements, and collected acoustic signatures used to improve sonar classification and tracking. And retrieval missions recovered Soviet test weapons from deep water, allowing American engineers to analyze design approaches and identify vulnerabilities. But the incident in 1981, when Seawolf became trapped on the seabed, lost her underbelly gondola, and was detected by a Soviet trawler, illustrates how close submarine intelligence operations operate to the edge of disaster. Submarines conducting covert missions in Soviet territorial waters accept risks that peacetime rules of engagement do not adequately address. If Seawolf had been unable to break free from the suction holding her on the bottom, the crew would have faced a choice between remaining trapped until the reactor shut down, leading to eventual loss of the boat and all hands, or surfacing inside Soviet waters and surrendering to Soviet forces. Either outcome would have been catastrophic. The loss of the submarine would have killed 70 crew members and civilians. Capture would have provided the Soviet Union with intact American intelligence equipment, cipher machines, and operational procedures, plus the propaganda value of parading American sailors as spies caught inside Soviet territory. The fact that Seawolf escaped demonstrates both the skill of the crew and the advantages of nuclear propulsion. A diesel-electric submarine trapped on the bottom in Soviet waters would have exhausted its battery power within hours, forcing it to surface or suffocate. Seawolf, nuclear-powered, could operate submerged indefinitely, applying repeated attempts to break free, accepting equipment damage as the price of survival. The loss of the gondola was not anticipated by the designers who installed the skids, but it saved the submarine by eliminating the structural connection that was holding her down. The trade-off, stealth for mobility, was acceptable under the circumstances. Seawolf could no longer operate covertly with her damaged keel, generating excessive noise, but she could transit at high speed to international waters before Soviet forces could intercept. The intelligence value of Seawolf's operations is difficult to assess precisely because the missions remain partially classified. Declassified documents acknowledge that Seawolf participated in special operations and earned multiple awards, but they do not specify what intelligence was collected, what locations were surveilled, or what impact the information had on strategic decisions. The Navy Expeditionary Medal, awarded for the 1981 deployment, confirms that the mission occurred in hostile waters and involved significant risk, but the citation provides no operational details. The Presidential Unit citation that Seawolf would later receive acknowledges exceptional performance in classified operations, but again, no specifics are disclosed. What can be inferred from the broader context is that submarine intelligence operations during the 1970s and 1980s provided information critical to understanding Soviet submarine capabilities at a time when the Soviet Navy was expanding its ballistic missile submarine force and deploying quieter attack submarines that challenged American acoustic superiority. The intelligence collected by Seawolf, Halibut, Parche, and other spy submarines informed decisions about where to position American attack submarines to intercept Soviet boomers, how to allocate research funding to improve sonar and signal processing, and what tactics to employ during exercises and potential wartime scenarios. The intelligence also supported arms control verification, allowing American negotiators to assess whether the Soviet Union was complying with treaty limitations on submarine deployments and weapons systems. If you have found this investigation into the hidden costs and covert operations of Cold War submarine technology compelling, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Cold War Chronicles, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story of the technologies that pushed boundaries and the crews who operated them at personal risk. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from, or if you or your family members served aboard submarines during the decades when experimental reactors, covert missions, and environmental consequences were all part of the invisible war beneath the surface. Every like, every comment, every subscription helps preserve these stories and ensures that more people understand the real costs of the technologies developed to win the Cold War. You are part of keeping these memories alive, and we are grateful for your role in sharing these complex chapters of history. The decommissioning of USS Seawolf in 1987 and her eventual recycling in 1997 closed a chapter of submarine history that spanned 30 years and encompassed both spectacular failure and quiet success. The sodium-cooled reactor experiment failed because the technology was too complex, too dangerous, and too maintenance-intensive for operational use. But the lessons learned from that failure informed subsequent reactor designs, and no American submarine has been built with liquid metal coolant since. The Special Operations missions succeeded because Seawolf's crew adapted to equipment that was experimental, operated in environments that were inherently dangerous, and accepted risks that are only partially understood even decades later. The comparison between USS Seawolf and other submarines of her era reveals how specialized Cold War operations became. USS Nautilus, the first nuclear submarine, was designed to demonstrate that nuclear propulsion worked. She succeeded, but she was not optimized for any specific mission beyond proving the concept. USS Skipjack introduced the teardrop hull and high speed, establishing the design template for attack submarines that persist to the present. USS Halibut pioneered deep ocean intelligence collection, finding K-129 and tapping Soviet cables. And USS Seawolf bridged the gap between experimental technology and operational intelligence missions, proving that submarines could rest on the seabed, operate specialized equipment at depth, and conduct covert operations in contested waters, though not without cost. The cost included the S-2G reactor lost somewhere on the Atlantic seabed, the underbelly gondola torn off during the escape from Soviet waters, the years of maintenance required to keep aging equipment operational, and the stress on crews who operated a submarine that was constantly breaking down but still expected to perform missions that conventional attack submarines could not accomplish. Seawolf's crew members, officers, enlisted sailors, civilian technicians, worked rotating watches maintaining equipment that required constant attention, conducting missions that could not be discussed with families, and accepting that their contributions would not be publicly acknowledged during their lifetimes. The broader legacy of USS Seawolf includes the environmental consequences of ocean disposal, the intelligence contributions of covert submarine operations, and the technological lessons that informed subsequent submarine design. The S-2G reactor, though lost, remains a symbol of the experimental technologies pursued during the Cold War, without adequate consideration of long-term environmental impact. The intelligence operations, though successful, demonstrated the limits of what submarines can accomplish in contested waters without detection, and the technological innovations, seabed skids, gondola-mounted equipment, diver lockout chambers, proved that submarines can be adapted for specialized missions, but that adaptation increases complexity and vulnerability. USS Seawolf was the second nuclear submarine ever commissioned. She operated for 30 years, underwent 2 major conversions, conducted missions on both coasts and across the Pacific, earned awards that cannot be fully explained in public documents, and was eventually dismantled and reduced to a sealed reactor compartment stored at a desert site in Washington state. Her reactor, the original S-2G that defined her experimental phase, remains lost on the Atlantic seabed, a reminder that Cold War decisions about radioactive waste disposal created problems that will persist for centuries. And her crew members, now aging, carry memories of missions that remain classified and experiences that shape submarine operations in ways that will not be fully understood until documents still sealed are eventually released. The story of USS Seawolf is not a story of unambiguous success or failure. It is a story of technology pushed beyond safe limits, of crews who operated equipment that should have been better designed, of intelligence operations that provided valuable information at the cost of significant risk, and of environmental decisions that future generations will have to address. The submarine that was supposed to represent the future of nuclear propulsion instead became a cautionary tale about experimental technology. The submarine that was supposed to be decommissioned after the reactor failure instead became a spy submarine that conducted missions for another 15 years. and the submarine whose legacy should have ended with recycling in 1997 instead persists through the radioactive reactor that remains lost at sea and the classified documents that will eventually be declassified, revealing the full scope of what Seawolf accomplished and what was sacrificed to accomplish it. This is Cold War Chronicles. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the invisible war beneath the ocean's surface and the real costs of experimental technology, please subscribe and turn on notifications. We have only just scratched the surface of the secrets buried beneath the ice and the decisions that shaped the Cold War in ways that are still being discovered. Thank you for ensuring that the crew of USS Seawolf and every submariner who operated experimental technology in the most dangerous possible environments are not forgotten. Their service demonstrated both the possibilities and the limits of what human beings can accomplish when technology, courage, and national security collide beneath contested waters. They deserve to be remembered, not just for their successes, but for the risks they accepted and the consequences that persist decades after their submarine was reduced to scrap metal and sealed radioactive waste.